Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me for this plenary session at the conference of the Florida State Music Teachers Association. As you know, the theme of this conference is breaking barriers through music. So I'd like to speak about breaking the age barrier at which we have traditionally begun the study of music. For quite some time, the age of 5 or 6 has been the accepted age for beginning to teach music to children. But infants have an innate connection to music. They come into this world hardwired to make music, and in fact are more equipped to learn music than to learn language. Once we realize how much infants already know about music when they're born, we can reevaluate how and when we might begin the study of music. Infants are born with amazing melodic and rhythmic abilities, unfortunately often lost by the age of 1 because we don't nurture those abilities. We don't even realize infants have them. We need to help every infant become the musical person he or she is, forgetting the concept of appropriate age and changing the how and when we teach music. As some of you know, I write a blog called The Musician's Brain. I actually haven't posted anything for quite some time because I've been writing a book, which I will talk to you about at the end of the session. But if you go to themusiciansbrain.com, go to links, scroll down to FSMTA Plenary, a page will open with links to all of the research that I'm talking about, as well as links to books, videos, websites, etc. So we're going to begin by looking at a couple of videos of infants and a toddler moving to music.
You guys ready?
And another one.
We turn off the music and watch what happens. Okay, I'll turn it back on.
What we see in both of these videos is that the movement is spontaneous. They aren't working at trying to be with the music. It just happens, and moving to the beat makes them happy. They're totally involved physically and emotionally. We all know that emotion is an integral part of how we experience music, and movement is part of that emotional reaction. Or as the 19th century German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche said, we listen to music with our muscles. And think about how often you move to music, tap your feet, nod your head. In fact, you may have found yourself moving to these clips. The brain uses some of the same neural networks to process both music and movement. But we have socialized ourselves, especially as classical musicians, that when we go to classical music concerts, we don't move. But that really isn't a natural human state. A few years ago, I was at the conference of the Pennsylvania State Music Teachers, my home state, and a pianist named Glenn Utch gave a marvelous presentation on female ragtime composers. It was unfortunately at 8 o'clock Sunday morning, a time when many people were a bit tired. But I happened to be sitting sort of towards the back of the hall, and I could see a lot of people in front of me. As soon as some of these ragtime tunes started, I felt I just had to move. But I'm looking around the crowd, and not a soul is moving. Nobody's nodding a head. doing anything. We have socialized ourselves to not move. But as the morning went on, more and more people started keeping time with the music. There's a relatively new field in the past decade called embodied music cognition. And it looks at perceiving music as based on action, understanding music through the body as well as through the mind, just as these children were experiencing music. There are a couple of articles on the handout about music and movement. Stravinsky understood the emotional power of music. He said, "I haven't understood a bar of music in my life, but I have felt it." And you certainly can't listen to the Rite of Spring, Symphony of Psalms, or many of his other works without knowing that he felt music. The infants and toddlers in the previous clips were feeling the rhythm and feeling the emotion, and they were showing both. So not only do infants move to music, 2 to 3 day old babies can detect the beat. In a study by researchers in Budapest and Amsterdam, babies heard a simple rock rhythm with hi-hat, snare drum, and bass drum through self-adhesive ear couplers, and then they heard several variants. One of the variants had a missing downbeat, and that's the one that caused an electrical response in the baby's brain. It was measured through EEG with electrodes attached to the scalp. As you can see here in this photo is not from that particular study, but it was measured the same way. The electrical response in their brains indicated they had expected to hear the downbeat, but they didn't. At 2 days old, they're not moving to music, but they're hearing the beat, and their brains notice when the downbeat is missing. The ability to detect a beat is called beat induction. That's what makes it possible for us to clap to music, make music together, dance to a rhythm. It was thought earlier that beat induction was learned in the first few months of life by parents rocking their infant. But this study shows that it's either innate or learned in utero. And beat induction is important because it's also important because the auditory abilities that underlie beat induction are what make it possible for infants to adapt to the rhythm of parents' or caretakers' speech and to learn how language works. It's never too early to be introducing children to music because some neural pathways for music are already active in the brain. So what are we talking about when we talk about neural pathways? This beautiful image shows nerve pathways in the brain, and all of these pathways are how we function in the world and how we make music. They connect all the various parts of the brain that make our functioning in the world possible. This is an actual image. It is not a drawing done with a technique called diffusion tensor imaging, which allows them to color the networks and show direction of the nerve fibers. Our brains are obviously not red, blue, and green. So some of these neural pathways are present at birth, like the ones for breathing, heart rate, movement. And researchers are increasingly learning that there are some neural networks present at birth for music, such as those that allow a 2-day-old baby to detect a missing downbeat. Others are developed through experience, learning, injury or disability, and also music. We create neural pathways in the brain when we learn to play a musical instrument and also when we learn a piece of music. So we're born with some neural pathways for music. We create others. This is a little bit off topic, but it shows the tremendous power of music. In just the past few years, music has been used in neonatal intensive care units, NICUs, to significantly improve preterm infants' heart rate, respiratory rate, and stress level, as well as to increase oral feeding volume. Remember, we said some neural pathways are present at birth, like those for heart rate, breathing, and movement. The baby couldn't live if that were not the case. The ability to suck is also present at birth, so babies can feed. But in a premature infant, those pathways haven't had time to become securely wired. And researchers are finding that music helps with the wiring of those pathways outside the womb. In one study, preemies who received 60 minutes of recorded vocal music daily in the NICU were able to consume more than babies who received only some kind of routine auditory stimulation. So the increase in feeding means an improvement in daily weight. And there are a couple of articles on the online handout that relate to this topic if you want more info. We're going to talk about many of the musical abilities with which infants are born, meaning they're hardwired for music. But I think this research is tremendously important in showing how music can help babies born prematurely, help their brains to wire. So as we've seen, 2-day-old infants can detect the beat in music. Toddlers love to move to music. Parents love to post videos of their toddlers moving to music on YouTube, and researchers like to study the movement of infants. So researchers in the UK and Finland did a study with 120 infants, some in each country. They were 5 months to 24 months. And they listened to music while they were being held passively by parents who were wearing headphones through which they heard spoken text. So they couldn't influence the movement of the baby. The babies, on the other hand, were hearing last movement of Mozart's Eine kleine Nachtmusik, both in a rhythm-only version and in the instrumental version. Hearing the last movement of Saint-Saëns Carnival of the Animals. They were hearing some speech, a children's song, and drum beats. So researchers assessed their movements just by looking at them, but also by 3D motion capture technology, which makes it possible to do an exact mapping of movement time onto musical time. So the infants or the toddlers would have sensors wrapped around ankles and around forehead. And as they move, that creates motion capture data that researchers can compare to musical time and see exactly in the music where the movement is happening. So we're going to listen to a couple of clips. The first is to the Eine kleine Nachtmusik excerpt, rhythm only. The second excerpt will also be Eine kleine Nachtmusik, but the instrumental version. And watch this infant during the first iteration of the theme, kind of looking around and bouncing a little. And then when it repeats, the whole body gets involved. So unlike the babies in the YouTube videos, the researchers actually studied the movements with 3D motion capture to see how well synchronized they were. And curiously, the better the infants were able to synchronize, the more they smiled. And this is embodied music cognition, feeling music with the body. So what about synchronization? These 5 to 24-month-olds were clearly trying to synchronize, but the muscle control isn't yet there for them to be able to do that. So at what age are they able to begin to synchronize? Researchers had previously thought that children weren't really able to synchronize to a beat until about the age of 4. But 2 researchers from the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, Sebastian Kirschner and Michael Tomasello, reasoned that from an evolutionary standpoint, music in prehistoric cultures was a social activity. And in many cultures still is. People sing and dance together as part of everyday life. So they wondered if, due to this biological foundation of music as a social activity, if children might be able to synchronize spontaneously at a younger age in a social situation. So they designed this study in which they had 36 children in 3 age groups, 2.5, 3.5, and 4.5. And they had 3 different conditions. So with each child, the researcher would say, look, here's a radio. And it was an MP3 player made to look like a radio. Listen, there are drum sounds coming out of the radio. Can you drum along? And then there was something like a computer audio visual, and they'd say, look, here's a drumming machine. Listen to how the machine drums. Can you drum along with the drumming machine? And there was a hand drumming. And then the social condition. The researcher would say, I'd like to drum with you. Listen to how I drum. Can you drum with me? And children as young as 2.5 were spontaneously able to adjust their drumming tempo to match the beat, but only when it was with the researcher, not with the recording or the video. And all the children synchronized better with the adult in a play situation. Okay, these are lab conditions. What happens when you have a young child in a real life setting? So let's listen to 3-year-old Kazuma playing taiko. I love this excerpt. He's looking around and he's just very, he's involved. He's clearly feeling it with his whole body. And taiko, the arm movements are very complex, and an adult couldn't synchronize with the beat any better than Kazuma is doing. And to be doing that at 3, he obviously had been drumming for a very long time. So what about other rhythmic capabilities? We spoke earlier about beat induction, being able to detect the beat. Every culture has sound patterns with repetitive structures, with a beat, but they're not always the same. Western music is primarily based on simple and compound patterns, 2 or 3. Other cultures, Eastern European, African, Indian, use complex or asymmetrical rhythm patterns, might be 2 + 2 + 3, 3 + 2 + 2, etc. So in a joint study at Cornell and the University of Toronto, they took 3 groups of participants: North American college students, meaning Canadians and Americans, first or second generation Bulgarians and Macedonians, and 6-month-old babies. They all listened to Serbian and Bulgarian folk dance songs. Some were in a simple 2+2 meter, some were complex, 3+3+2, 2+2+3. Then in each experiment, they listened to variants. So here you see an original 4/4, and then the variants, they either added an eighth, turned the quarter note into 2 eighth notes, so it maintains the 4/4, or they added an eighth note beat, so you'd end up with 9 eighth notes instead of 8. In the asymmetrical meter, which was 7/8, again, they replaced the quarter note with 2 eighth notes, maintaining the 7/8 meter, or they added an eighth note, so you ended up with 8 eighth notes instead of 7. The North American students couldn't distinguish the variants with the asymmetrical meters. The Eastern Europeans could distinguish all the variants because they were used to hearing them. And the 6 to 7-month-old infants could distinguish the variants in both the simple and the complex meters. 6 to 7-month-olds. But by a year, when they did this at a year, the infants had become enculturated to music of their own culture, which in this case was 2+2, and they could no longer distinguish the variants. However, after a brief time of listening every day to the complex meters for, I think, 2 weeks, the infants could again distinguish the variants. North American students still couldn't. So what does this tell us? It's the old use it or lose it. Neural pathways in the brain that aren't being used are pruned, whether they have to do with language or music. All newborns have the capacity to learn any language, and they have the ability to discriminate speech sounds from languages they've never heard. But by the time they're a year, they're responsive to a far narrower range of speech distinctions. The pathways have been pruned for the sounds that they're not using. Earlier research seemed to show that 6 to 9-month-olds preferred a steady 2 or 3 beat, but this study clearly shows that they're equipped to respond to any kind of beat. And if they grew up in a culture where an asymmetrical rhythm is common, that's what they would prefer. So let's listen to a clip.
Oh, what about? Oh, remember that one?
Clearly, he's feeling it in his body. And Isaiah, like Kazuma, who we heard earlier, obviously started doing this at a younger age, and they become very conversant with the music of the culture in which they grow up. So we're going to come to melody and pitch, but I want to take just a moment first to touch on the whole discussion of which came first, language or music. In his book, The Singing Neanderthals, cognitive archaeologist Stephen Mythen proposes that our Stone Age ancestors used a sort of proto-musical language with inflections in pitch, rhythm, and timbre to bond with infants and to bond with each other. There is a wonderful article, I have a link on the handout, by Anthony Brandt, who's professor of theory and composition at Rice University's Shepherd School of Music. He argues that music is often thought to be ancillary to language, but in fact, it's the other way around. Language is ancillary to music. And it's not just about music coming first. He makes the point that music hearing, or how we are wired to hear music, is essential to acquiring language. And Nina Kraus from Northwestern argues the same thing. There's also a link to Kraus's lab on the handout. Kraus and her lab have a wide range of research that shows that the kind of listening we do for pitch, rhythm, and timbre in music have a direct bearing on language learning and therefore on academic performance. So, what are the melodic capabilities of infants? They prefer singing to speaking. It's why mothers sing to babies. It's why they use baby talk, what researchers call motherese or parentese. But as we know, baby talk is a simplified and repetitive type of speech with exaggerated intonation and rhythm. And this is actually thought to stem from mothers in primitive societies using that proto-musical language to bond with babies. So it's in our DNA. Singing is particularly good for keeping babies from fussing, and babies remain calm longer when they're listening to songs than to speech. Isabelle Peretz at the University of Montreal and Sandra Trehube at the University of Toronto did a study with 7 to 10-month-old infants from French-speaking families. They had them listen to recordings of baby talk and adult speech in Turkish, and then play songs also in Turkish. First, we'll hear the Turkish baby.
Mini mini bir kuş donmuştu. Pencereme konmuştu. Aldım onu içeriye. Cik 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 ötsün diye. Pır pır ederken canlandı. Ellerim bak boş kaldı.
And then they listened to a Turkish play song.
Mini mini bir kuş donmuştu. Pencereme konmuştu. Mini mini bir kuş donmuştu. Pencereme konmuştu. Aldım onu içeriye. Cik 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 ötsün diye. Pır pır ederken canlandı. Ellerim bak boş kaldı.
They listened to about 9 minutes of the song, 6 minutes of baby talk before showing what researchers called cry face, when the baby is just ready to lose it. And then they had a different set of infants listen to French baby talk and singing, and it was 6 minutes before cry face with the French songs and less for speech. So they listened longer to songs than speech in both languages. What's interesting is that they listened longer to songs of another culture. Researchers in this study didn't address this, but other research has shown what's known as the novelty preference. Very young babies, 1 to 3 months, prefer listening to songs they've heard before. But once they become older, they like to hear something new. They prefer singing to speaking because the melody is the message. One of the first things babies understand communicatively is emotion. Music carries emotion, so the melody is the message. As you know, lullabies are sung to soothe infants, more upbeat tunes to have fun. From the age of 3 months, babies can recognize happiness in the art music of their culture. By 6 months, they can identify sadness, fear, and anger. Infants of 8 to 9 months can recognize a transposed melody as long as the relationship between the pitches is the same. That's what researchers call relative pitch. They don't use the term relative pitch in quite the same way musicians do. For researchers, relative pitch just means recognizing a tune no matter what pitch it starts on. By the time, well, anytime between 5 and 10 months, infants can recognize a melody when the tempo changes. So happy birthday sung very slowly is still recognizable. Most researchers who are studying the biological foundations of music agree that two musical skills are fundamental to the evolution of music. They seem trivial to us because almost every adult has these skills, whether or not they have been trained in music. The two skills are beat induction, the ability to keep the beat, and relative pitch, this ability to recognize a familiar tune, no matter what pitch it starts on. Infants have both of these. And these are primary examples of cognitive traits that are adaptive, meaning they're passed down from generation to generation. So infants can detect a missing downbeat by the age of 2 days. And they are quite good at recognizing tunes, but that's not all. They have skills, abilities, harmonically as well. Until recently, researchers were saying that babies preferred consonance to dissonance, but they were using babies born and brought up in a Western culture. So when they started thinking about the fact that some cultures value dissonance, like folk singers in Croatia singing in seconds, they revised their studies. And a recent study of 6-month-olds in Canada showed that there's no actual difference in preferring consonance or dissonance. The babies preferred whichever they had just been listening to. So just as babies by the age of 1 prefer the rhythmic patterns of the culture they were brought up in, same is true of the harmonies of their culture. They become enculturated to the rhythms and harmonies of their own culture. But at 6 months, they're open to anything. Infants have good memories for music. 2-month-olds can recognize familiar melodies. And in a study from Finland, University of Helsinki, women who were in their final trimester of pregnancy played Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star to the fetus every day during the final trimester. And then 4 months later, I mean, the babies hadn't heard Twinkle, Twinkle in the interim, but 4 months later, their brains reacted more strongly to Twinkle, Twinkle than to other tunes they remembered. Other studies have shown that the fetus reacts to music and language, but this was the first one that tracked how long fetal memories remain in the brain. And this photo you saw earlier is from that study. 7-month-olds recognize Mozart. Study had 7-month-olds listen once a day for 2 weeks to slow movements from 2 Mozart sonatas, piano sonatas, K281 and 282. Then they didn't hear any Mozart for 2 weeks. And when they were tested on excerpts from the middle of those movements versus slow movements from 2 other Mozart sonatas, K280 and K283, they preferred the ones they hadn't heard before, the new ones. So again, this is the novelty preference. Very young babies like to hear the familiar, but by 7 months, they wanted to hear Mozart they hadn't heard before. So infants demonstrate an astonishing variety of musical capabilities. So if this is the case, why aren't more people fluent in the language of music? Let's talk about language versus music. As I said, all newborns have the capacity to learn any language and have the ability to discriminate speech sounds from languages they've never heard. But by the time they're a year, they're responsive to a far narrower range of speech distinctions because that's what they've been hearing. we see that infants have significant musical abilities. So what would happen if we approached the learning of music the same way as we do language? We all grow up hearing language, sometimes for hours a day. By first grade, children can speak in complete sentences and express complete thoughts. They have a vocabulary of 5,000 words or more, a fairly good command of language by ear without knowing any rules of syntax or grammar. When they're introduced to letters and words, they have a template in their brains for the sound of language, for phrases, for words, a template to which they can attach the spelling of a particular word. No one would consider trying to teach a child to read when he's barely able to speak. So why do we do that with music? Pianist conductor Daniel Barenboim grew up in a household with two parents who were both piano teachers. And he has said that everyone he met played the piano and everyone who came to the house made music. So playing the piano was a natural part of his life as a child, and it was just a natural form of human expression. He grew up hearing music, began piano lessons with his mother at the age of 5, and as you know, by the time he was 11, he was playing with the Berlin Philharmonic. So our brains are hardwired for language, but they also seem to be hardwired for music. So why don't we approach learning music the same way? Should infants have some kind of music lessons? Well, Laurel Trainer at McMaster University designed a study to test the difference between active and passive music experience for infants. Parents and their 6-month-old infants were randomly assigned to active or passive music classes. The active classes used Suzuki early childhood education classes. They learned lullabies together, nursery rhymes, action songs, movement activities, playing little percussion instruments. And then the parents used CDs of the songs from the classes at home to repeat these activities with their infants. It was all interactive, parents and infant. In the passive classes, they just listened to music from Baby Einstein CDs while they were playing at various playstations with balls, blocks, or books. There was no interactive music making. And then parents used the Baby Einstein CDs at home. So after 6 months in the active classes, infants showed earlier sensitivity to pitch changes. They preferred listening to a piece that stayed in the key rather than having some out-of-key pitches thrown in. And brain imaging showed larger or earlier responses to musical tones, meaning the brain was actually changing as it does when we learn a musical instrument. But also, babies in the interactive classes had better early communication skills. They smiled more, they were less distressed, and when they were distressed, they were easier to soothe. All the babies heard music. The difference was in the interactive exposure. It wasn't just listening, it was participating. It was parental involvement. Babies are involved, are interacting with parents with language from day one. That doesn't happen with music, and that has huge implications for how we teach music. In the next slide, you're going to hear Isaiah, the djembe player, at the age of 4 months. We heard him earlier at the age of 5. Here he is at 4 months.
If you're happy and you know you clap your hands. If you're happy and you know give mommy a kiss. If you're happy and you know give mommy a kiss. If you're happy and you know then your face will shine show. If you're happy and you know give mommy a kiss. Mwah, mwah.
He obviously isn't with the beat, but he is interacting with a parent and learning by the interaction. Birth to age 5 has been considered a sensitive period for learning language for a long time. They used to say critical period, now they prefer sensitive period. Researchers still say there is no sensitive period for music as there is for language, but all of these studies we've been talking about tell a different story. It's critical not in terms of learning to play an instrument, but in being exposed to the sound, learning to sing, learning to move to music, having participation with parents. Children need to have the sound of music in their brains so they have a representation to which they can attach notational symbols, just as they have the sound of language in their minds to which they can attach symbols when they're introduced to spelling. Today, listening and learning to sing before learning notation is called sound before sign, sometimes sound before symbol. But Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, and their contemporaries all learned that way. Prior to the middle of the 19th century, that's how everyone learned to play an instrument. They obviously practiced scales and arpeggios, but they learned melodies by rote, or they reconstructed melodies that they had internalized by repeated hearings. They learned to improvise. But what changed all of that was the advent of printing in the mid-19th century. When it became commercially viable to mass produce books, method books began to appear. And almost all method books emphasized proportionality of note values and pitches learned according to where they are on the staff. Modern methods include repertoire, but many still depend on notation from the first lesson. They associate notation with fingering, not with sound. Learning music by learning notation has often replaced learning by ear, but that's the equivalent of learning a foreign language by studying the alphabet and how the words look without ever having learned the language. It simply doesn't make any sense. And yet there's still somewhat of a debate about whether notation or understanding by ear should happen first. Musicians for decades have been advocating sound before sign, such as Lowell Mason, America's first public school music teacher, advocated that children should experience music before learning notation. Annie Jessie Kerwin was probably a remarkable piano teacher, born in Dublin, later moved to Scotland, where she met John Kerwin, who was an advocate of movable do solfege. She married his son Spencer, and then over the coming decades, she published multiple books, music books, and essays under the name of Mrs. J. Spencer Kerwin. She wrote a pianoforte method in 1886, which eventually ran to 20 editions. And in the Teacher's Guide in the 1913 edition, she says, one of the fundamental mistakes in pianoforte teaching has been that only one sense was appealed to, and that the wrong one. Music reaches heart and brain through the ear, yet we have usually tried to reach it through the eye. It was always look and never listen. Children were introduced to notation before they had consciously observed any of the musical phenomena which the notation symbolizes. So already by the early 20th century, which is only like 60 years after the advent of commercially viable printing, but already at the time she wrote this teacher's guide, the oral tradition of learning music was already gone, and people were trying to learn notation first. I have a link on the handout to an essay she wrote for a periodical called The Parents' Review in 1898 called Music Teaching. And she says that mothers should be singing to their babies from the very first. And if the mother doesn't feel comfortable doing it, the nanny should do it. So, Emile Jacques Dalcroze promoted good flow through music and movement, embodied music cognition. Hungarian Zoltán Kodály advocated singing, listening, and movement first, notation second. German composer Karl Orff advocated building musicianship through integration of music, movement, speech, drama. Again, embodied cognition, feeling music in the body. The Japanese educator Suzuki introduced his Suzuki method after World War II. You're all familiar with the concept. Some of you probably teach it. Children learn to play by ear. Notation is added later, and the method relies on parental involvement. And he created this method after struggling to learn German. He noticed that children don't have any difficulty learning their own language by the age of 5 or 6 because they heard it all the time. So they all become proficient in speaking their native language. So why shouldn't the same thing work for music if children heard it and were involved in it from an early age? The American Edwin Gordon was the first music educator to engage in systematic research and field testing to determine how we actually learn music. And he concluded that music is as basic as language to human development. And of course, he advocated singing first, notation second. So the idea of being able to hear music in your mind before you begin to learn notation has been around for a long time. As Ed Gordon said, you don't need a particular method to teach sound first. Children just need to learn to listen, to sing, and to move to music. Midori Koga at the University of Toronto wrote an article in the American Music Teacher a few years ago. It's listed on the handout about using solfege, singing and movement to promote musical understanding. When children learn to sing first, they will have a sound template in their brains to which they can later attach notation. So if infants are hardwired for music, and if this little guy continued to hear and make music on a daily basis, would we have more professional musicians? Probably not. Everyone learns to be proficient in language, but not everyone becomes a writer or a public speaker. But making music for pleasure would certainly be a part of more people's lives, and more people would be able to participate in music at some level. I would like to alert you to the release of my new book, The Musical Brain: What Students, Teachers, and Performers Need to Know, to be released by Oxford on the 3rd of March. It covers what I've spoken about here concerning infants, but also what we should know about the brain in terms of practice, memory, cognitive advantages of studying music, and a great deal more. There is information on the handout about ordering directly from Oxford and receiving a discount. So just to reiterate, the handout is available at themusiciansbrain.com. Click on links, scroll down to FSMTA Plenary. And please feel free to contact me if you have questions, either at my bucknell.edu email or through the blog site at The Musician's Brain. I believe when this video is concluded, there will be a question and answer, online question and answer session, and I'll look forward to speaking with you then. So thank you very much.